The demo we're going to be doing today is the overlap assignment, which is a very early assignment that most animators will do at some point when they're first starting to learn animation. It's essentially a squirrel, animating a squirrel tail. So you animate a ball moving through the scene, and then you animate a tail following behind it, and you want to make it feel like it's overlapping in a nice, interesting way. Now, there's a lot of things that we can learn about this assignment. The main goal and why it's called the overlap assignment is because we're learning overlap. We're learning how do things react when they are built off of another movement. So this is things like hair, cloth, anything that follows another force. And this is very important because you're going to be animating a lot of those as an animator. And overlap is kind of everywhere. Now, overlap isn't just for inanimate things like hair or cloth. It can be things like an arm or even your spine. Your spine, if I move my hips and kind of do this motion, that was overlap right there, where my whole body kind of did this wave. If I do this, my arm overlapped right there. My elbow does this wave motion in here as my main upper arm motion affects it. So understanding how to apply overlap and how it works is going to make you a stronger animator overall. It'll make having characters come to a stop feel more organic versus just and freezing. You're going to get that more natural motion. You're going to be able to make just more dynamic shots overall. Now, it's tricky. Overlap is one of those things that honestly I see animators struggle with for years because it is so deep a topic. There's overlap in all sorts of different things. So this demo here is not going to be about the one key thing that will make overlap like super easy and done in a second. No, because that just takes a lot of practice, lots of observation. There's so many different variations. The goal of this demo is going to be a way of approaching it that makes it a little easier so that you're not just guessing and hoping and then having to restart over and over and over and over again. So that's going to be the goal for today. Now, once again, today we're going to be animating a squirrel jump. So as we're doing this, something that's very important is that we want to make sure we get the body working first, because the tail will rely 100% on what the body is doing. If the body changes, the tail needs to be redone completely. So it's going to be very important that we get the body working first, where it's going to be working in a layered fashion here. Animating the body, get that 100% right, then animate the tail. Because once again, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it's very important, if you change the body, it's going to affect the tail, and you might have to redo the entire tail. So making sure your body is as good as possible and as polished as possible will just make everything better in the long run. So when we come to the body, there is something that we need to pay attention to, and that is the way that the character is going to land. Now, we already did the bouncing ball assignment last week. We animated a bouncing ball, and I talked about how we typically want the body to, or sorry, the ball to hit the ground and bounce out with a very specific pattern. Specifically, as the ball bounces here, you have ground, your contact right there. The frame before the contact should usually be higher than the frame after the contact. This is a physically correct bounce. Now, what I mean by that is when an object is falling, if it is not animate, like a bouncing ball is just a ball and it's landing on the ground and not being hit by anything, they're just bouncing, it's going to gain momentum, lose energy, bounce up, and whatever energy is left causes it to bounce. But because it's going to be less energy, because some energy got dissipated into the ground, it's going to be lower than the frame before. That gives the idea that the object lost energy. We're going to be animating something that gains energy, potentially. So you can do this by either hitting the object. So imagine a bouncing ball, but instead of just bouncing on the ground, you're hitting it with a tennis racket or a baseball bat or something like that. Suddenly that gains energy. There's momentum being pushed in right here, which means that we can reverse this. And now we can have this actually go way up here. And there's their frame after. Now with a character that's alive, honestly, it can go either way, because a character can decide to make a bigger jump or a smaller jump. So while this rule is going to be very important, we now have to choose. And this is the thing, we're not disregarding this rule. We are now choosing when to use it to get a specific feeling in our jump. So I just animated this quick example here, just so we can kind of see the feeling that'll happen there. So in this case, with the bounce, this is a typical bounce. So if we scrub through this, you'll see that it comes in, frame before the contact, frame after is a little lower. And when we watch this, we get the feeling of kind of this loss of energy. It's kind of bouncing, and it goes off. Now, let's bring in the second one here. So this one here, I animated, and this has the opposite, where the frame before is lower. So you can see that frame before the contact, frame after is a little bit higher. Now, you're probably not going to really feel that much of a difference, but what's essentially happening right now is it feels like it has a little bit more energy. It has a little bit more pop. Like this ball is kind of a happy ball instead of just a sad like boom, 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 coming down. Now it hits and it's going to pop up. It has more energy because literally more energy is being pushed into it. Now for a bouncing ball, yeah, exactly. It feels alive because it's putting energy into the action versus just losing energy as it goes along. So now we've got more life into it. And this is how, like, if you're animating a bouncing ball and you want it to, even if it's just a inanimate bouncing ball, if you want it to feel like a happy bouncing ball, make the scene happy. Like maybe it's Toy Story and it's supposed to be this just toys playing and having fun, and it's supposed to be this joyous scene. This would make a bouncing ball feel happy versus the other one where it just feels like it's losing energy and not sad, but you have that kind of just neutral feeling. So right there, we can change that feeling, but we're doing it consciously. This would be the opposite of what would be physically correct in most cases, unless something is putting more energy into this, like the ground is bouncing it up. And someone asked here, what would happen if the ball bounced on a trampoline? You would still lose energy because you're dropping down, you land on the trampoline, and the trampoline will keep you bouncing longer than if you bounced on the ground. And just as an example, just don't do this. But if you were to just jump and land on your butt on the ground, you're not going to bounce much. You jump and land on a trampoline, you're going to bounce back up. But you're going to bounce lower than you started from because you don't have the same amount of energy to push you back up. The trampoline itself is not adding energy. Now, if ever you've been on a trampoline and you've done the double bounce, where someone bounces, hits the trampoline, and then another person jumps up and like smashes into the trampoline, now you've got another person's body weight transferring to the trampoline and pushing the first person back up. And that's when you suddenly get like twice or three times as much height and like fall off the trampoline, which Cameron and I have done a few times. Yeah, exactly. Bounce straight to the hospital. I don't know how Cameron and I didn't go to the hospital. We had so many close calls with the trampoline. It was so stupid. The energy has to come from somewhere. Okay, so we've got this element in here. Now, as we're animating a character for this assignment, the other thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding squash and stretch to our character. So squash and stretch is going to change things quite a bit. And there's a few different rules that we can use with squash and stretch that's going to make a character feel even more alive. And technically you can use this at any point, but if you don't have squash and stretch, it's really hard to actually show it and to actually feel it. So here is the same, and there we go. Same animation, but with some squash and stretch to it. Now, there's a few different things to pay attention to when you're doing squash and stretch, which we're going to be covering as we animate this. The biggest thing is that when you're adding your squash and stretch, the stretch should always go along the arc of motion that the character is jumping in. So an example of where this would be incorrect would be is if this ball was stretching this way as it's coming down like that. That would be very strange. Essentially, it's just squashing now. It needs to stretch along the arc that is falling. So if it's dropping down this way, that's the direction it's stretching. So we've got that. And in this case, I'm animating this in the frame before is a little higher than the frame after. So if we look at this, frame before, frame after, it's just a little bit higher than the other one. That way it kind of feels like it's maybe bouncing to a stop versus bouncing and trying to gain energy. So we've got this. Now you'll notice on the contact frame, we're going with a squash just to help show that buildup of energy. The reason this is important when you're adding the squash and stretch is it really helps to make a character feel much more alive. So an example here would be, imagine you've got a character coming down for a landing right here. So we're just going to do this. So characters coming down right through there. Now, if they land and they just do this like that, and then from there, take off, that's going to feel very strange. Doesn't really feel like they're jumping, does it? A character, when we land, we have to absorb the impact. Otherwise, you would shatter your knees. You would shatter your hips. Your bones would break. If we just landed on the ground like that, you would be in so much pain. Instead, we need to squash, absorb the energy, and that also builds up energy for the next jump. This also just goes for even inanimate objects. When you slow down the footage, when they hit the ground, they will usually squash a little bit because of that energy dissipating through. So instead, when the character lands, we might get into something more like this. Right through there, and let's clean up those legs there. So something more like that. And now you get that spring, and you have that visual contrast where you have that anticipation shoots out. You feel how much more energy that has compared to the other one where we're just gonna slid across. So squash and stretch really helps to make a character feel alive, but you need to make sure that that squash and stretch feels correct. Again, if you're jumping out in this direction, you will stretch in that direction. If my character here was jumping like this, but headed in like this direction here, this arc, that would be very strange because now he's just being like pulled randomly in that direction. You would need to go in that direction. Now, maybe he jumps and he goes chest first, and we do want those feet coming down. In that case, you would need to push your pose to have that energy feel like it's still pushing in that direction here. So something like that. So you're still getting that energy going in that direction, even though his head is not facing that specific line. I hope that makes sense. Essentially, wherever the energy is going, that's the direction the character's line of action, their energy, also needs to go. Otherwise, it's not going to feel connected in any way. So, as we're doing this, really pay attention to your stretch. Which direction are you going in here? Now, aside from that, everything else is pretty close to just a standard bounce right here. But we can push this even more. And this goes into a principle that we're going to cover quite a bit when we do the personality walks, especially, but we can cover it here, which is the importance of contact. And what I mean by the importance of contact is right now we have a bouncing ball that's in the air, then on the ground, and then in the air again. So essentially what we're doing is we're skipping the contact frame. The moment that the ball touches the ground, but hasn't reacted yet. So what happens when we add that contact frame in? So right here, we now have this ball, but unlike the other one, we now have the ball coming in, contact, you can see it's still stretched, but touching the ground, comes in, comes out, is still touching the ground, and then moves out. Let's see what that looks like here. See how that feels both squishier, but also a little bit more controlled. It feels like the ball is trying to not hurt itself as it's going down and hitting the ground, which actually goes back to the question we were talking about before about how do we sit down on the ground? And do we ease in, do we not? This is not easing in. We're still hitting the ground hard. But by showing that contact frame, we soften the blow because we're not going from way out here stretched flat right here. We show that little bit of a connection and then morph in that in between right there. And that creates a feeling of motion and control. Now, a good example of this, and some that I've used many, many times on this stream, and many of you will probably know what I'm about to talk about, is the punch. So if ever you want a character to really feel like they're slamming into something, really hitting hard, what you want to do is you skip the contact frame. So you do the bounce before this version, where essentially you have your object here, and then it hits, and you don't show this frame. You don't show this, because this softens the contact. Instead, you go from here, and then keep going. That makes a nice hard impact. But when you have a character jumping, they're not slamming into the ground. They're not doing like a Mario butt pound, slam into the ground, try to break a brick block. No, they are trying to land and jump. Think of a cat, think of a squirrel landing. They're not slamming into the ground, they're not jumping and slamming into the ground. They're controlling their motion. So by showing the contact frame, it softens the blow. It still feels sharp and hard, but it shows that level of control. And the same thing would be going, like if I was to animate a punch, I would want to avoid this. But if I'm animating someone touching someone else's cheek and just doing like a soft pat on the cheek, that would be very nice to show that contact frame because it'll avoid feeling like the character is slapping the other person. And it's just going to be that nice gentle tap, or like tapping on someone on the shoulder. I don't want it to feel like they're just slamming the person on the shoulder there. So this concept of do you show the contact frame or do you skip the contact frame is a very powerful tool in our animation arsenal because it allows us to show how intense we want that impact to be. And this goes especially for walks, which we're going to be talking about next week, where you can have a very careful walk where a foot contacts down and then places itself down, or you go from here and flatten out and just go straight into a stomp. That's going to give you a lot of power in there. So we've got that bounce right here, and we can go one step further, which is that when we're landing, we don't have to just have the one frame of contact. So for example, here on this last version that we have, I added 2 frames when the ball is on the ground. So right here, it contacts the ground right there, comes down, squashes, and you'll notice that I kept it at a little bit of an angle. So it's still kind of traveling down at that angle this way, squashes through and down, and then comes up. And thank you so much for the sub, Animated Paul. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I will be doing reviews and feedback after this demo. So definitely get your links ready. I'll be doing some feedback in a little bit here. So by doing this motion now, what we're getting is this nice kind of roll through that jump. And if we look at it at speed here, you'll notice that it just gives a little bit more of an anticipation to the drop, where the character anticipates, rolls, bounces through. It makes it more of a purposeful jump. Now, in this case, it feels a little odd because the bounce afterwards is lower than the bounce before it. The more time you spend anticipating down on the ground, typically the higher you want that jump to be. So I would normally want this jump to be a little bit higher here to match the amount of anticipation that I'm building. So we can hold this for even longer. So with all of these, we have kind of this library of different bounces we can add. And there's so many more that we can do. This is like the basics right here. So let's kind of bring everything back here and just compare all of them. So you can see we get all sorts of different bounces here, and each one feels slightly different. Now, for a squirrel type character, what I would typically recommend, not that you have to do this, again, this is where you as an animator have a choice. What is your character? How are they jumping? But typically what I would recommend, if you're not sure, is to go with this one here. The contact the ground on the stretch, come down, stretch while still touching the ground, and then come up. Because that's a nice mix between controlled and not anticipating too much. So you're spending 3 frames touching the ground. It just tends to make a character feel more alive. What I would definitely try to avoid for a character that's living, so a squirrel, for example, is either of the 2 first bounces, because those are so sharp, just comes off the ground like that. It feels like a marble. It feels like a bowling ball. It doesn't feel like something squishy and alive that has bone or muscle or tissue. It feels like a stone. So knowing how to make that bounce feel more organic is going to be very, very helpful to us. So I hope all of that made sense. A very long explanation on bounces. But hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully it was helpful. And the form is, I'm going to open it up once we're ready for feedback. So whenever we're done this demo here, which shouldn't take all that long, we'll see how distracted I can get. So there we go. So with all of these bounces, let's actually animate the character that we're going to be working with today. So I'm just going to make a new scene, and we're going to set this up from scratch. So I'm going to create a reference, and I'm going to find, this is going to be the Taylor rig right here. So this is a very basic rig, but honestly, we don't really need anything super complicated. Now, for this assignment, I want this squirrel to jump from left to right. Is there a specific reason? Not really. That's what I want to do this time. Now, I could take the whole character here and just spin them 180 degrees right there if I'm working in the orthographic view right here. But there is another thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that right now we're looking at the side view, which is the side profile view. But at any time, we can actually switch from left to right side view. To do that, just hold down the space bar, click and drag, or sorry, just click and hold on the Maya button right here in the middle. And you're going to notice you have left view and you have right view. And if I switch this to left view, now I'm on the left side of the creature, or the opposite side. If I go back to right, boop, there we go. I'm on the other side. Same thing with the front and back. So like right here, we're looking at the character from the front view right there. If I wanted to look at the character from the back, hold down spacebar, click and hold, back view. There we go. Now we're looking at the character from the back. So if ever you want to switch your cameras, especially your orthographic, it's all built in right there. So with that, let's actually quickly create a ground plane. So let's do this. And there we go. And we're just going to make this nice and big right there. I'm not going to worry about the grid. We don't need to see it. There we go. Okay. So we've got our character pretty much in place here. And now the length of the animation, I'm going to try to keep it short so that we don't spend a ton of time animating a tail. So I'm going to put 100 frames right now, but I think we're going to get less than 50 total. We'll see. Okay, so we're pretty much ready to start animating. But like I said before, all of our animation is going to depend on what the body is doing, not on the tail. So at this stage, I don't need to see the tail. So normally when I'm animating something like with a tail, a big overlapping action, this could be a dragon, a dinosaur, a lizard, a cat, a dog, whatever it is, I'll usually hide the tail. So on this rig, there's tail visibility. I'm just going to turn that off. Boom, done. We don't need to see it. So with this, I can now just start animating. Now, normally what you would want to do is to have some sort of game plan in here. Make sure to prep first before you just jump in and randomly move things around. And in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to think of what I want. Now, something I don't want is 3 very even, boring bounces. So I don't want just bounce, bounce, bounce. That would be very boring. Bleh. Not interesting. I want a rhythm in there. So an easy way to do that is small, medium, large. There we go. So in this case, let's do a medium bounce, big bounce, and then we'll end with a small bounce right at the end. So something like that. And this will just help to add a little bit more rhythm. So we can do a little bounce or a medium bounce, big bounce, and then just end with a little kind of to a stop there. Or vice versa. We could maybe start with a small, then big, and then end with a medium. We'll see. We can play around with it. And in terms of timing, when I'm trying to figure out the timing, I just try to visualize it in my head, if you can. Just visualize it, and I just make the sound effects. Like it's just going to be a character sitting there, holding, and we're going to have little, I don't know how it's going to come through on the microphone here. Little boonk, 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 and just like that timing of that. Boonk, boonk, and I'll just do sound effects like that and just try to time it out. If I can't time it out mentally, I'll just record myself and then time out the time on the recording. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And at least to me, by doing it this way, it just kind of allows me to just jump right in and get some interesting timing versus just guessing and hoping and seeing what I end up with. So based on this, let's do this very roughly. And I'm just going to get the jumps in place first here. So we're going to go from frame 11. We're going to hold for 10 frames. That way it gives us time to just look at the squirrel, make sure that it's in the scene. And then we're going to get a little boom. Let's do 8 frames for that first jump. So it's going to move forward here. Boom. Maybe that'll be a little bit smaller. And then we're going to go from there. Let's do 8. Let's do 14. So that'll be 33. So we get that big jump there. And then we did an 8 frame jump, a 14 frame jump. If this one's going to be the medium one, let's go 10. Okay. So something like that. Cool. So that's going to be the overall timing. We'll change it as we go. And right now, I'm just going to need to add in the peak frames right now. So add that peak here. This would be a good time to turn on my resolution gate so I know how much height I have to play around with. And I'm just putting that middle key right in between so that I can get that nice peak right there. And if I look at my graph editor, I should be able to see the visual difference between each bounce right here, right through there. Okay, so let's see how this feels. Okay, this jump is definitely way too high, but something along those lines. Yeah, we'll go with that for now. Now, does this really feel like a great jump? No, because we're just basically roughing it in. Right now, I'm more worried about just the overall timing, composition, and feel of the whole thing versus trying to get everything like 100% correct, because I don't really care about being 100% correct right now. I want to make sure my core, my base, is solid. If my base animation here is not working and I just have terrible timing and my character is bouncing off screen, well, I'm going to have to change everything anyway. So I'm just trying to get this kind of basic layout. This would be what I would almost consider previs levels of animation, where you're just figuring out your composition and your layout more than anything, and the overall timing of the scene. So, cool. From there, let's just make a very rough cleanup of this. And we're just going to go with the bouncing ball rules. So that way we can see the difference between the bouncing ball and then a character bounce. So a bouncing ball, essentially what we would do is, I'm going to just do this very roughly here. Let's break all these tangents here. Animate this coming through. Get that nice hang time in here. So something like that. Now it's bouncing. Dunk, dunk, dunk. And let's see how that feels. There we go. Much better already. Cool. So, yeah, this would be considered staging in a sense. It's trying to figure out the overall layout of your scene so that you would have a good frame to work with and you're not just kind of throwing things in randomly and hoping for something. Making sure everything fits, that the audience can see everything correctly. Very, very important. Now, we've got the overall translate Y kind of in place. Cool. Let's fix the translate Z, because the translate Z, that's the forward translation in this case, is going to be very important. And the most important aspect here is that when the character is in midair, nothing should slow them down. And this is one of the most common issues that I will see in many, many body mechanic shots, whether a character is swinging, jumping, doing any sort of running, anything like that. If the character pushes themselves off of the ground, let's say in a jump, and they are now mid-air, they're not going to speed up or slow down their forward momentum mid-jump. There's nothing, unless they've got a jetpack or wings that they can kind of push through the air with. The amount of energy that they leave the ground with is going to be constant until they hit the ground again. If you're really, really picky, there might be a slight degradation in that arc where you start to slow down. But honestly, you'd have to jump off of like a super tall building for that degradation to really kick in, because our bodies have mass to them. And the jump is not going to be enough to affect that compared to the air density and all of that stuff. So from takeoff here, frame 11 to frame 19, I want this to be linear right there. From frame 19 to frame 33, I want this to be linear. And then right to the end here, I want this to be linear right there, from frame 33 to 43 right there. And just to make this a little bit more visual, let's do this. So the first jump is going to be small, not too much forward momentum. Next jump, really big, a lot of forward momentum. And then we're going to slow that down there. But you can see how that's linear, straight. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you that nice feeling of continued force through the jump. There's no way for that character to speed up or slow down midair, so it just stays straight. And honestly, it's much easier to animate. Now, does that mean that has to be the rule in all cases and we never break away from that? No. That is the starting point. From there, we can start to think, okay, how do I stylistically push this? Do I want to push more hang time? Have that character jump and have that like, whoa, freeze, whoo, and then they come down really fast. At that point, it's a choice, but we're making that choice. And this is something that's very important to me when I'm animating. I never want things to just happen because. It needs to happen for a reason. It needs to happen because I am choosing for it to happen, not just because, oh, I guess that's what Maya gave me. Let's go with that. So always be making choices in your animation and think through why you're doing something. Okay, so we've got the body here, but so far we're just animating a normal body. It's nothing special. It's just a bouncing ball that's somewhat more alive than normal. We want this to be a character. So let's just kind of animate this straight ahead. We're going to animate the first section, then the next, and the next, and the next. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to start adding the squash and stretch, as well as anticipations, and trying to make this character feel alive. So at the beginning here, the thing that's making this character not feel alive is the fact that the character goes from an absolute still, there's no motion here, and then just boonk, pops up off of the ground. Where'd that energy come from? Don't know. It just appeared out of nowhere. So what I'm going to try and do here is I'm going to play with this. Let's have him hold for 4 frames, maybe 3 frames. And then from there, I'm going to take my stretch control, and on this frame, just before he leaves the ground, let's squash that character right there. So now that character comes down, whoop, and then comes up right here. So frame right after this, let's stretch this out a little bit. So you're going to go from the squash into that stretch for the takeoff, like so. Okay. So right there, we've got that takeoff feeling a little better, but there's a lot of things wrong still. Let's focus on the first part. As it anticipates down, something that I really don't like in my own shots is when anticipation is straight down like this. It's just kind of boring. So what we want to do is add a little rotation in here. So for example, maybe as the character's doing this, they're going to rotate backwards slightly. So we get a little bit of that. And then as they come forward, they're actually going to start leaning forward into that jump before they take off. So we get something like this. But you'll notice something. The character's just pivoting on the ground, spinning. If we look at that little butt there, that line right down into the center, if we imagine that's the butt or the foot, wherever the character's putting their weight, is just slipping and sliding on the ground. Well, how do we stop that? Honestly, just manually put it where you want. And this is something that's very important about this assignment in the animation process, is that there will be times when you're animating where you're not going to have the control that you want, where you're going to have this moment where things don't quite do what you really want it to do. And in those cases, as an animator, you just put the thing where you want it to be. That's it. Think of it like in 2D. If I have a character holding something on this frame, like there, and I move the hand over here, I take the object and I just draw it in the character's hand over there. That's it. There's no special trick. There's no special technique. You just draw it where I want it to be. In this case, it's pretty much the same thing. I want that character's butt to stay in place here. So I'm just going to take this And on that rotation back, I'm just going to make sure that it stays pretty much in the same spot right there. There we go. Now as it takes off right here, same thing. Like that. So now it rolls right through. Now you'll notice that there's a little wiggle right here. That's fine. I can always tweak it later and fix it. But this kind of gives me that base right there. So in this case, the other thing I want to do is a couple of frames as it rolls back. I'm going to take that anticipation, the squash here, and I'm going to go upwards a little bit. So I'm going to anticipate the anticipation. You want to be very careful with this. Don't go too far. You can anticipate the anticipation forever. But in this case, I'm just going to add a little stretch right here. So essentially, as the ball comes back, you see it come back, stretch, and then come down and around. And it helps to push that roll through there. And what buttons are you pushing for that butt to be manually anchored to that spot? I'm just keyframing it. That's it. So I have auto key turned on, so it automatically puts keys for me. So I'm just moving it and it's keyed, and then that's it. That's all I'm doing. There's no special techniques. It's really just putting a key where I want it to be. Okay. So right there, we have that anticipation back. Now, one thing I really want to do here is I want to layer things. Notice how the rotation and the stretch all happen at the same time. Since I'm animating in this layered method, I can just offset my stretch here by 1 frame. So now I have that ball start to roll and then stretch. Or I could go the other way, which I think is what I want, and have that roll start a little later. So now the ball starts to stretch first and then rolls back. So something like that. So we get a little bit of a stretch and then go through. Okay. So we can spend a ton of time going over the fine tuning of this. Like, for example, one thing I would do is I want to ease into that squash here a little bit more so that it doesn't just slam down. So I want to ease in here just a little bit more. So it goes up and then goes down a little faster right here. Yeah, so something like that. But we can refine that later. I do feel like I should adjust my translate Z here a little bit. And essentially, if I'm doing this and I'm having this little wiggle, what I'm going to do is just make sure that my rotation is working the way I want it. So in this case, I don't want that rotation to ease to a stop. It should be jumping quick. So let's kind of push it this way. Rotate, just keep rotating quickly. It goes into that jump. Once I have that in place, I can just take my translation here. And if I do want to make sure that I have it accurate, a quick trick, not that you have to do it, is just create a locator. And with a locator, essentially what I can do is place this right at that point where the ball meets the ground there, and then just use that as a marker. So just right there. Now as it rolls back and then forward, I can just nudge that, make sure that at no point is it sliding backwards. There we go. Done. So it's just kind of making sure that I get the things working the way I wanted them to, and not just what Maya is giving me. There we go. Now I can get rid of that. So let's take a look at what we have here now. So we've just done the beginning. And what we're doing here is we're making it feel like the character is actually taking the jump themselves versus just moving randomly, like it just thunk and moved across with no point. So if we just watch this here, suddenly, see how that beginning feels a lot more alive? Suddenly that character feels like it's living, it's anticipating, it's jumping and stretching, and then it just dies across the rest of it. So already we're starting to get that life in there, but it comes from the anticipation, the squash and stretch, and giving the character time to make a choice. If it's living, energy is not just going to come out of nowhere. It has to come from somewhere. And that's what the anticipation is. Let's see. Is it a bad thing if you have too many keys on your timeline to make Maya work your way? No. As long as you're controlling your keys, you can have keys on once, and if you know what you're doing and why you're putting those keys, that's fine. If you feel like you have too many keys, you can always clean them up. So for example, my translate Z here, I put keys on ones right here just to make sure that the ball stays perfectly in place. Well, let's say I don't want this on ones. I need to be able to remove some keys just in case I need to retime some stuff. What I'll do at this point is I'll just buffer my curve right there. So I'll click on this button right here. That buffers the curve. And essentially you see this outline of where the curve used to be. If you don't see that, just make sure to go to View, Show Buffer Curve, which is right here. Now I could delete these keys and then just reshape my curve to match the previous line that I used to have right there. There we go. Now I don't have those extra keys in there. And I still get that nice clean result right through. So I could set keys on ones, make sure I know exactly how that arc should look, and then clean it up. There we go. But the biggest thing here is you are controlling your keys. You are not letting the keys control you. So for example, I offset curves here, which is going to make it look really complicated right there in the timeline, because I know that's what I want and I know the result that I'm going to get from that. If I'm just offsetting things randomly, and especially before I've gotten my timing and everything else done, I'm just going to be asking for trouble. Locator or whatever, super useful to track a point in 3D space like a ball or a footspin or toes on a walk. Yes, I love locators. I use them all the time in my work. They're just great little things to just place around as markers, as just like, okay, I want my character to stop here, go here, put all of these points in place. They are great for all sorts of different things. Okay, so let's go with the rest of the jump here now. So we're going to keep going here. Now I feel like for this little jump, this is quite a bit of stretch. So I'm going to just tone that down a little bit right there. And before I start going too far with this, first I'm going to rotate this so that the character is angled in the direction that I want. And now we have a choice. Based on those bounces that we had done before, I could keep it like this, where we have the character anticipate down and then boom, bounce up. Or I can keep him on the ground here, right there. So it stretches up, and at this point I would probably increase the stretch here a little bit. And then go up into the air, like so. So I'm adding that extra frame to the ground right there. Same thing here. So this, let's actually do the extremes first. So this is the contact, this is the squash, and this is going to be a big jump, so we're going to squash this down quite a bit here. And I'm looking at my graph editor to make sure, yes, that is bigger than what I had here. I'd never want them to be just the same squash each time. So it jumps up, comes through. Now let's do the frame before the contact. So there we go. So this is going to be the stretch before the contact here. And if I want to animate it again, where the character is hitting and then stretching across the ground, I'll just place it where I want it to be. So it's landing right there. I was way off the mark here. So something like that. Okay. So stretch, definitely way too much stretch for this small of a jump. Okay, so we've got that. So now what we're building is that 3-frame contact, where we've got let's go over here. Contact, down, squash, and then we're going to bounce up here, which we haven't done yet. But as we've done this, you're going to notice that something feels a little off. One is our translate Y. Our curves got all messed up. So let me just clean this up here. And the big thing that we want is to make sure that on this frame here, that those curves still look like a bouncing ball. That's kind of the key here, is the bouncing ball. Even though we're doing a character jump, when they're jumping in the air, it's a bouncing ball. So we're going to get that nice arc right through there. Okay. What else is feeling a little off? Well, the squash and stretch is not quite working right. Because if you think of the squash and stretch, it's going to stretch out and then it's jumping really quick. And that stretch right now is just easing to a stop here. If it's snapping up, more than likely that snap is going to kind of ease out much more quickly. So something more like this. So instead of like that slow ease, it's going fast and then eases at the top here. Now as it stretches as it's coming down, it's a bouncing ball. It's not anticipating the ground. So it's not going to stretch, hold that stretch and then hit the ground. It's going to keep stretching until it hits the ground. So I don't want that to ease in either. So just doing that, now our squash and stretch is going to feel much snappier and just a little bit more interesting. And then the next thing is our rotation. Now this is something that I always look for in my shots, and I look for in other people's shots as well. If ever you got a critique from me, you might have heard me say this on some of your shots, is try to avoid things that are perfectly flat or zeroed out. So for example here, when the character reaches the peak, their rotation is perfectly zeroed out. Flat. Boring. That's just a character, like, again, if we animate a character jumping in the air, they're going from their squash pose over here, really getting ready to go. They're going to land over here at this nice dynamic angle right there. And in the air, they're just doing this. That would be boring. If they're just straight flat going across the air, that's not going to be interesting. It's going to be much more dynamic if they've got some sort of angle to them, or maybe like they're pushing forward with their chest, or like maybe feet curled in, something like that. There's some visual interest in there. In this case, even though it's just a ball, what I want to make sure is that the character has some sort of lead or follow. And this really just depends on how you want the character to feel like they're jumping. If they lead with their body like this, it's going to feel much more purposeful because the nose of the character kind of leads a little bit more. If they lean back a little bit more like that, now the character is going to feel a little bit more cautious, like you're getting that kind of whoa before hitting the ground. So I'm going to lead a little bit here just to add a little bit more visual flair right in there. So something a little bit more like this. And now if we look at that jump, there's no frame where the character is perfectly zeroed out with nothing happening. Now I do feel like my jump is a little fast here. I might have to add an extra frame or lower the jump. Let's see how it looks at speed. Yeah, it's not so bad. It's very springy. And let me, just to avoid this looking really weird, which it already does, but let's zero that out. Okay. Yeah, let's take my translate Y and I'm just going to lower it ever so slightly. That'll help slow it down. Okay. So let's just kind of look at that here, see what we've got. There we go. So that's that first bounce. And you can see how it's feeling much more springy and alive right now. And I feel like I've got a little too much squash and stretch still, especially for that small of a jump. But we're going to leave it like that for now. Okay. So now, you'll notice that our other jump kind of got messed up because we're adding more keys in there. Once again, we're just trying to think of that 3-frame contact and jump. So there's our squash pose. Technically, squash pose. Again, see how it's all perfectly zeroed out? I don't like that. So I'm just going to angle this character back a little bit. So we get that kind of squash starting to rotate in place there. And then as they take off, this is going to be the stretch. And they're going to be touching the ground still. And once again, I just look at my rotation on the ground there, make sure that it feels correct. No special tools, just moving it where I need it to be. So we get something like that. Oh. And then let's fix our translate Z. Make sure that that is linear, which I think it looks like it is. Yep. And then our translate Y. Bouncing ball. That's really what we're looking for here. So something like that. Bounce. There we go. We get that nice punk bounce right there. And from now, we just keep going and doing the same thing right up until we get to the end. So let me read a few questions here and then we'll just kind of breeze through the rest here. Autumn Animator will do that rig review on one of the alumni dailies, if that's okay, just because a rig review is going to take a little bit of time, and I'm assuming we're going to have quite a few people today. Let's see, would you do cleanup of curves in polish? I have to, a lot of stuff on ones, but I have never gotten around to cleaning curves, and I think I need to start doing that. Usually I'll do that in the refining polish phase, but honestly, it really depends. My workflow is very loose. So sometimes I'm going to do that on the spline pass. Sometimes I'm going to do it even in blocking plus, where I'll just start cleaning up my curves. Really, it's for me, it's whatever the animation needs at that time. So as long as the animation looks good on screen, that's the most important thing. Clean curves doesn't really matter as long as the animation is interesting. Let's see. Do you know why those curves create overshoots on the graph editor when adding breakdowns? It's because of the tangents. So if you adjust your tangents manually, so like right here, I've adjusted this tangent manually myself, and then I've done the same thing here. If I set a key in Maya, hit S right through here, make sure I'm setting a key on the right frame here on my translate Y, hit S, see what happened? It got all wiggly. The whole curve just went blip. And the reason for that is Maya is trying to help. That's the sad part. It is trying to help. And it's going, oh, you moved this curve exactly here, and you moved, sorry, this tangent exactly here, and you took that tangent and put exactly there. Well, I'm going to put in a key for you, and I'm not going to touch anything because it doesn't want to disturb what you already did. Which is great, except that it just ruins the curve because those tangents are now too stretched. They don't work with this new key in place. So you would either need to clean up those tangents yourself, clean those through, or at this stage, once you're starting to adjust your tangent curves and handles, I usually stop using the set key button, the S key on the keyboard. Instead, I'm going to start using the insert key tool, which is holding down the I key. And you'll see how my cursor changes to a little crosshair. Now I can just middle mouse click on that curve. So I'll select it, middle mouse click while holding I, and it inserted a key and kept the actual curve exactly how I had it by adjusting all the other tangents to make that fit. So now you'll notice that that tangent is much smaller there, and so is this one, and they're working with this tangent. So at that point, when you're starting to work your curves and really refining them, insert key tool is going to be your best friend with that. And it'll help just maintain your curve structure so you're not just getting these weird wiggles all the time. So hopefully that helps there. Okay. And then I think there was one other question. Oh, the alumni dailies are coming back next term. They start in week 2. So yeah, not this upcoming week, but the next week after. So yeah, alumni dailies are coming back. Okay. So with that, let's kind of go through here. So once again, we've got our structure now. We've got the overall timing. We've got the overall range of motion. At this point, we're just refining things. We're putting the extra breakdowns. This is essentially breakdowns at this point. We're describing how this character jumps and just working through it all. So as the character jumps here, they're going to jump up into the air right there. Now, squash and stretch, once again, I don't want it to just like have this weird plateau right there. So I'm going to make sure that that eases in so it loses its stretch pretty quickly right through. I also want to make sure that my rotation matches the direction of the jump. So right here, once again, same thing. Except this time I'm going to push that curve a little bit higher right here. So as the character is jumping, they're supposed to be going up into this position here. But see how they're already straightening out a little too soon right there? So I can manually just rotate this in place right there. Get that where I want it to be. Until they start kind of reaching more of the peak. And then at the peak, let's just make sure that they are still leaning forward slightly before coming down. And there we go. So that takeoff, I think the other thing I want to do is make sure that I'm going to add an extra key here for the squash and stretch and just really make sure that at the peak, it stops stretching a little earlier. I don't want it to be too stretched and just like zero out right at the peak and then come out. I want it to be almost zeroed out for a while there at the peak. Because really it should only be stretching when it's moving quickly. The moment that it slows down, you're going to lose the stretch. Now, some people will actually squash the ball at the peak as well. I'm not usually a fan of that because unless the character is anticipating at the top, like doing this kind of jump here where they're at the top and they're like squished in really high like that. Normally, I just find it kind of takes away the visual contrast because you have the squash here, then you have a stretch, and then you have a squash, and then you have a stretch, and then you have a squash, and then a stretch. It's just squash, stretch, squash, stretch, squash, stretch. By squashing here, stretching, relaxing, coming to just a regular state at the top, and then coming back down, I just feel it for something this simple because we don't have limbs and arms and legs and everything. It just makes it a little bit more dynamic. Okay, so let's go through here. So this is going to be the squash pose right there. So let's just get that in really quick. This is going to be a stretch right there. And this is also going to be on the ground. It's not that one. Okay. So. Like that. Let's roll it back a little bit and make sure I don't have the ground selected. And you'll see I'm just manually putting in position, nothing fancy. Okay, so we've got that. At this point, I'm just going to double check my translate Z, make sure that's linear in the air, and then quickly clean up my translate Y. So something like that. So it comes through, starts to stretch. It's starting to stretch a little too soon. So I'm gonna just insert a key here, bring that down, and then also make sure that this doesn't ease right there at the end. So we get something more like that. Same thing with the rotation here. I don't want it to ease too much right through there. So now we have that coming down, get right through there. There we go. Now, once again, contact. Let's not let that land just perfectly straight in line. That's boring. Okay. And then we're going to go for this last jump right here. So let's just key this in place right here. So this is going to be the stretch. I'm not going to go too far with it here. This is the medium jump. Angle it forward. Place it on the ground. Okay. So like that, that's pretty good. Let's do the next contact and then we can fix the mid-air section. So this is going to be a little bit of a squash. I don't want it to be too much here. It's going to be a little bit of a stretch. And then this frame is on the ground. Okay. I hope all of this is making sense so far. I know it's kind of going, we're going a little bit faster now going through this, but it's really just trying to get that feeling of momentum through the object. And really trying to get that feeling that the object isn't just a bouncing ball. Even though we're using the bouncing ball principle through all of this, we don't want it to just feel like it's a ball. Because at that point, it's just going to be boring. It's just another ball. This needs to feel alive. It needs to have a purpose to its movements. And needs to feel like it's actually a creature with thoughts and ideas. Okay. So the squash and stretch is definitely way too high here. So you'll notice how the curves in the squash and stretch kind of creates this bowl-like structure. It's not always going to be the case, but it's usually what I try to aim for, because it just gives a little bit more variety to the squash and stretch. It doesn't feel like it's just boring and kind of flat. Let's definitely fix all of this. And this is the other thing you'll notice, that as I do something, I inevitably break one part. So for example, I had all my translate Y nice and clean. As I put more keys in, it breaks the translate Y. But that's okay, because I know I'm doing it for a reason, and then I can very quickly fix it. So it's not like I am fighting this and constantly just undoing, redoing work. It's all kind of for a purpose right through here. I feel like I've got a little too much stretch there. And the translate Y here feels a little high. I'm going to lower that. Okay. Cool. So now we've got all the bounces in there. So let's see how this feels just with the bounces in place. Let's see. Do I break my tangents even while animating a full body rig? Yes. And what instance do you consider breaking the tangents? Honestly, when I need to. When I need to not have an ease, for example. Let's say a character is landing on the ground and their feet need to just slam into the ground. I'll break the tangents on the translated Y of the foot curve. I just have it come crashing down. So anything like that where I don't want some sort of ease to happen, I'll break those tangents. Now, do you have to break the tangents? No, you could just add another key in there. It really just depends on how you like to animate, whether you want to put more keys in or whether you want to just work in the graph editor. For something like this, a bouncing ball, just adding extra keys is going to be much easier. Okay, so there we go. Now it's a little bouncy and squashy, I feel, especially on the landings. It feels very squishy. So that's a very quick fix. I can just take my squash curves right here and just don't have them go so low. So I'm just going to lower that quite a bit here. Let's see. Okay, that already feels better. There we go. So now we've got that ball going through. We've got that nice squishiness, but you'll notice that at the end, it just freezes. And this is the next thing that I will see very commonly in these type of, I should save this, assignment 6. In these types of assignments is that just sudden stop. We want to keep a little bit of momentum going through here. So as this character lands, especially on this last landing here, I'm just going to give a few frames where the body is going to keep squishing. Imagine that they're taking the weight, they're trying to stop themselves. And then we're going to have to add a few more frames here. Let's see. Come down. Let's come back up here. Kind of stretch a little too high. And then zero out right here. So this is an overshoot. I'm squashing down, coming back up, overshooting, and then settling right here. Right there. Now, as that happens, I should also be having the body roll through. So we're keeping that momentum going. As they land, they're not just going to stop completely here. They're going to keep rolling forward and then come up before, let's see, coming back down. And now I'm going to zero out that rotation here. So it comes up and then down right through there. And let's actually ease that a little bit more. So something like that. Okay. So now that we've got that motion in there, all I need to do is hold the character in place. So once again, we can just do this manually, or since this is going to be a big range of time, what I'm going to do is just create my locator. And place that right where the ball is landing here. There we go. And now I can just make sure that that stays in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go every like 2 or 4 frames. Make sure that it's in place where I want it to be. And then from there, I can just break down that motion where I need it. So by going every, let's say 4 frames, essentially what I'm doing is I avoid the need to potentially have to do every single frame manually. As long as it's feeling correct on those main keys, then I can just go into my breakdowns and just make some quick adjustments here. So like that. Okay. So there's a little bit of a roll here. Honestly, I'm not too worried about it. If there's a little tiny adjustment, especially when I'm that zoomed in, we're not really going to feel it from over here. There we go. So, with that, we now have our bouncing ball. And it's feeling nice and squishy and alive. Now, is it perfect? No. I definitely feel like that middle jump might be a little high now that we've readjusted our timing and made our bounces a little bit more dynamic. But overall, not too bad. Yeah. For now, let's just call it here because I don't want, like, this is where we could spend a little bit more time polishing, but I feel like this is working well. We've got that nice settle. We've got that nice beginning. At this point, we need to animate the tail. Like, we've done all of this work on the body, but we haven't even done the tail, which is the whole purpose of this assignment. That's fine. You want to get the body here working first. If you don't have the body working, who cares what you do with the tail? It's not going to make a difference because you're going to have to reanimate it every time you have to make a change on the body. So take your time with the body. Make sure you really understand how it's moving. Make that really appealing animation in there. Once you have that, the tail will be much easier to deal with.